Good morning, folks. Welcome to the June 21st meeting of the Citizen Oversight Board. I'm Daniel. I'm the board administrator. I'm going to be walking us through the very beginning of announcements and getting us to the meat of our meeting, which is a discussion with Executive Director of Public Safety, Armando Saldate. So to kick us off, we have first thing on the agenda is the approval of the prior board meeting minutes from May 17th. Would anyone like to move to approve those minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Stefan. David. David, all in favor? Aye.
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 Excellent. Any opposed? The motion passes. Minutes are approved. The next thing on the agenda is some announcements to make. The first announcement is that the board continues to have 2 vacancies. We encourage folks to apply if they are interested. There's more information on the board's website. One of those vacancies is going to be filled by the mayor, and the other is by city council. So both of those application links are available on the board's website. Scheduling. Our next standard meeting is on July 5th. That is the day after Independence Day. And so given people's holiday plans and activities, we are going to be canceling that meeting. So the next board meeting is going to be on July 19. And that will be a meeting with the leadership of the new Office of Neighborhood Safety. For those who are watching us live, you've already figured out the new Zoom registration process. But for those who are maybe watching on YouTube or later, we have implemented a new registration process using Zoom that will allow, hopefully make everything a little easier with direct notification of canceled meetings, as well as reminders prior to meetings. Those registration links, registration is automatic, but automatically approved. The registration links are on the website, and there are 2. There is one for the first Fridays and one for the third Fridays meetings. So please make sure to register for both if you only registered for one. That does not apply to board members. All right, and then 2 reminders for board members. One is that board leadership elections are coming up in July. So our July 19th meeting will also have our board leadership elections. And then the other one is the Before the Badge program is running on July 8th through 19th. That's a DPD community orientation for new DPD officers that we've been invited to, observe and attend by Together Colorado. I plan on attending and will happily, debrief folks. But if you would like to attend part of that, please let me know. That is it for the announcements portion. So I will turn it over to Director Saldate to go through some of the questions that we sent in advance. And board members, please raise your hands if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you, Daniel. Good morning to everyone. Good morning to the board and to our community that are listening in today. Happy to join you all for my update, and appreciate you all sending questions over, and I'll dive right into those questions. So first, I'll read the question. I'll try to provide any context that is needed or explanation around the question, and then I'll give you my answer. Daniel, I'll rely on you to if you see any questions or hands raised up, please let me know. So the first one is a belated congratulations on your appointment confirmed by the city council. Does being confirmed change anything about how you can or will lead the Department of Safety? That's question 1. And do you have any new goals or renewed vision for how to lead the department going forward? Well, thank you for those congratulations. It was a very long process, as you all are familiar with and aware of. Just for the community on the line, for context, I'd been here in the city and county of Denver and working for Denver since 2014 after retiring from a public safety career prior to that in another state. I had started my work with the Sheriff's Department in the first part of their reform around their internal affairs process and was able to lead some of that change there, helped get their data team, a data team established there and online. And then in 2017, I moved over to the Department of Safety as a performance manager, held different positions, had the opportunity during the pandemic to, with Emily Locke, who's on this call as well, lead our COVID testing site, the Mass City County Denver COVID testing site. Through the COVID pandemic, I was promoted to an assistant deputy director for then director Murphy Robinson. And then when he stepped down, I was first appointed by Mayor Hancock during the latter part of his tenure as mayor in his last term. That was the latter part of 21, early part of 22. I was the first executive director of safety since it was a new law change that had to go through confirmation. So I was confirmed through the last city council, the previous council, to the one that sits today. With the new mayor transition, we worked very hard to transition and help the new mayor administration, Mayor Mike Johnston and his team get on board. I was always hoping to stay and in the role, and I, I was put forward that I reapplied for the job, and thankfully was blessed with the opportunity and appointed again by Mayor Johnston to serve. After a real strong, long vetting process, working with the community, the transition team, all those things. And so I was able to be reappointed and then confirmed within, I think it was about a month ago. That has been long process. It was, so the actual confirmation was more of a mere formality to me. It seemed like, I've been doing the job and been in this role. So, but I do recognize it, and taking that oath is strong, and it's always refreshing and a good reminder of my what I'm being asked to do, the great responsibility that I have and trust that's being placed in me, and it's one I don't take lightly. So to say or ask if I'm going to be, if there's anything different about my leadership, I would say no. From day one, I've always led when I was in an interim or when I was in the seat or when I wasn't. I have always led how I know how to lead and how I know how to do things. And I try to be a very thoughtful, a strategic, and a leader that with my decision making really based on what's best for first our city, our community, and then our department, and then our people, our staff. Our staff make up a majority of our budget. That large budget we have is mostly staff, and they are really what makes our system work. And so all those things are really, I try to be collaborative in my approach. I really try to really take a measured and apply a lot of my years of service and experience and what I've learned here and what I know about it, and really try to take that in. So I hope that whether I was not confirmed or not appointed yet or in the interim role is not much different how I lead today. And so I don't know of any marked difference or how I do. And I will always take the responsibility of this job very seriously. I don't feel any more comfortable in the role. I always feel like there is I have a great responsibility to deliver public safety. We are in critical times. Public safety is one of the most thought about and discussed topics, and is on the mind of everybody in our city. And right now it's been a very difficult time ever since we've transitioned out of the pandemic. Our society, public safety, a lot of things have changed, and so we are working very intentionally on trying to provide the best public safety to our community and to those visit and work and play here in our city. And so I take it very seriously, and I hope that I can continue to lead in this role for some time. Around new goals, renewed vision, the really exciting part about working with Mayor Johnston, as you all know, is he's very ambitious. He's very ambitious about fixing the problems of our city, the big problems of our city, and fixing them now, and doing them without delay, and doing everything we can. So he's really set out a very ambitious strategic outlook for us all. And we are working around wildly important goals. Those of you that are familiar with that term, really focusing on those, and safety is very central focused. And safety has a hand in everything, whether that goal is better government, whether that goal is roads to recovery. But obviously, safe cities is one of those roles where we are working ambitiously to have a high effect on violent crime. Reducing gun violent crime is one of those goals that we are singularly focused on, that we really want to make sure that we can affect. And so far, we are doing really good, and we're implementing strategies that I know you all are familiar with around place network investigations and all those things. And one thing that I hope you all have heard from me in the past, and I'll continue to echo, public safety isn't about arresting more people. It's never been about that. In fact, sometimes I think in the history of policing, sometimes people have thought of that and thought that that is the correlation. You arrest more people, there'd be less crime. That's not what it is. Safety is a function of not only policing, but it's also a function of community. It's a function of community involvement, activation. It's a function of public health. I've told you all when I first got on that one of my approaches to public safety is looking at it through a public health lens, especially what we are encountering now with addiction, substance misuse, particularly fentanyl, and then what we know about mental health and untreated mental health, and how that makes its way into public safety, either for calls for service, emergency calls, or dealing with folks in crisis. So and also in our jails, and as we're getting people re-entered back into our community, those are all things we need to overcome. So we're really focused on those strategies. We're also, one of the things that, when we talk about safety is, and me, Chief Thomas, Sheriff Diggins, and Chief Fulton, we all share this around transparency and accountability. That's one of the very important roles you all play for our city and our community in oversight. And that is something that we continue to work on. I think that Denver, and when I talk to a lot of our peer cities and I go to conferences, Denver is really at the cutting edge and has always led the way, from our implementation of an independent monitor, our citizen oversight board process, and all those processes that we've built in. And we continue to refine and work on public transparency, has really helped, I think, breed a culture of accountability and transparency. So that is something that we think is important. It's important that if you're policing a community and providing public safety, that you also are got to have the trust of that community. So that's stuff we're working on. So dive into the next question, and this is a very, I think, timely question around something that has been in the news cycle here recently with some controversy, but the question is, the Department of Safety has made no secret of the fact that there are aspects of the Civil Service Commission's hiring process that it finds frustrating. Has the Department of Safety made any recommendations to the mayor or to the Civil Service Commission for changes to be made to the police or firefighter hiring process? So thank you for this question. I think it is a very important question because there has been some recent controversy there that has made headlines. But I want to give some context and some background here. Coming out, and when I started my tenure in January of 22, we were in one of the variants, I believe it was Delta, or I'm get them confused sometimes, but a variant of COVID, and it was really impacting our staffing. I remember some of my first initial calls when I assumed the leadership role were having calls with our Emergency Operations Center and other agency heads across the city, because it had really impacted our staffing and our ability to staff and answer calls and staff fire trucks and ambulances and all that. Since that point and to now, staffing has been one of our #1 concerns throughout public safety, and I'll say it through all ranks of the city. It has been hard. after the tragedy of George Floyd's murder, the protests, the reform, all those things had an impact, particularly on our public safety staffing. In Denver 911, we had almost a 50% attrition rate. In policing, we lost several officers, and I think the pandemic also made people look at their work differently and how they came to work differently. So we all experienced the Great Resignation. So since then, we've felt extreme pressures around staffing our police departments and our first responders, especially. We have to have people that can answer the 911 calls, that can answer the calls and respond to calls and respond to emergencies. So that has been something that we saw early on. So I bring that up that this just isn't recent as of now, a now problem. We've been talking about this since coming out of the pandemic. It has been a problem. One of the early folks to raise issues with our civil service process or the current process was Chief Hazel. So that kind of just dates back to where we're at. And so the frustrations has been around the civil service process is obviously it's good to have an objective third-party process to make sure we're hiring good candidates, that it's not influenced by bias and all those things that I think a civil service commission and process really helps us have. And I think it's necessary. What I think has been the criticism and what our departments will tell you is that the current civil service process never adjusted to the new our workforce and new folks, great resignations, people's priorities and things like that. It wasn't as nimble as it's a long and lengthy process. It could take up to 6 months to hire someone and get them through that. And as we have people with shifting priorities and shifting and just that are different. It's a different workforce than when I first applied to be a police officer in 1993, and it was a full convention center of applicants trying to get like 50 positions. It's a much different workforce. So what we've urged Civil Service Commission leadership all throughout the city is looking at the civil service process and trying to make it more efficient. So early on, when I was here, we had our teams for here in safety administration leadership, our safety human resources, and the Civil Service Commission staff, not the actual commission, but the staff that work on it, engage in a peak academy process, trying to identify those processes and efficiencies. I will be honest with you all. That did not have the ideal outcome that we had hoped. I think it generated a lot of finger pointing. I think people got defensive and then put into silos, and it further put people in their corners around how they could fix this and what change was needed. So since then, we have been trying to work with the Civil Service Commission around recognizing change and how we can change our processes. One thing I want to be as crystal clear as I can about it. I have never and will never advocate for lowering of standards. I don't think lowering of standards of our applicants to get these very important jobs that have trust and character, all those things as that's never been our goal. What I have advocated for, and I know other safety leaders have advocated for, is a changing of those processes to understand where we've had silos, where we've had barriers to getting people through, barriers to getting diverse candidates through, where we've had disparate outcomes in testing towards candidates of color, and how we've tried to diversify our workforce, particularly adding females to traditionally male-oriented fire and police positions. So we've done, and we've tried to change those things. The other thing that has been something that nationally law enforcement, this is a national law enforcement problem. It's not just a Denver problem. And so there have been think tanks that have come together on this. I've been in conferences and everything where this is being discussed. It's probably being discussed in some forum somewhere out there in public safety right now, and what are the best practices. One of the guiding documents that came out was in October of last year. The Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Community Oriented Policing Solutions team, who puts out guidance documents to local and state and federal law enforcement at times, issued a document addressing this very problem. It was one, as soon as I got it, I shared with our Civil Service Commission and others. Before I had even read it and really was looking at it. And they also recommended and talked about how some of the same pain points we were seeing around times of the process, a different applicant pool, changing that to that. They've also talked about things like reconsidering polygraph tests. Polygraph tests are something that have always been controversial. These are tests that aren't admissible into court proceedings, but we still rely upon them to help vet someone's truthfulness and honesty. So this recommendation from DOJ was talking about that. There was other things that they talked about in re-examining what kind of assessments that you're doing. In our examination of the data, where we were seeing where we were losing applicants. So early in the pandemic, Great Resignation, we just weren't getting the numbers of applicants. We were very limited in the numbers of people applying. That changed. We really doubled down on our recruiting efforts. I think the economy changed. I think some attitudes changed, more people getting back into the workforce. And then what we saw is we were getting applicant numbers, but then we were getting high loss of those applicants at the initial stage. And that was the first stage was testing. It's a test that they take. It's an online test. It's something that's proctored. You have to do it. It's a very onerous test to get through. And that test also costs money. So we found that we were having people lose out to that, not even take the test, start it, not finish it. That paying for the test was becoming a barrier. So we absorbed that in our budget. We started paying for everyone that to take the test. These were things we were trying to do to fix the system to make sure we can get people through that barrier. We were finding outcomes that we were losing maybe up to 70% of our applicants that weren't passing it, doing that. So we saw this also in our sheriff's department. In sheriffs, we still have issues around hiring there. So what was different though, in the sheriff's department, they are not civil service commission based. So we were able in our safety human resources department, identify another testing process, one that didn't have these, really make it so that we had and develop it based on what are the needs to become a deputy sheriff, not a generalized test, but what are the needs to be a deputy sheriff and what are those administrative needs or tests that we can do. We implemented that with much more success. It's interesting because people will say, well, we lowered the standard or that we made an easier test. We did it. In fact, we have more people that the fail rate in that test is higher. However, because more people are advancing in that test, we still get higher numbers. So before we had less people getting through the test, more people passing the previous test. Now we have a test that more people fail, but because more people are taking it and actually doing it and completing it, we're getting much more numbers getting into the next area of the process. The other thing we worked on was the number of reviews and the level of reviews and things that we were doing as they were going through the process. And so we really streamlined those on our end. And those are things that we've asked that civil service do, and we've communicated that to civil service and the commission and talked about that. I know that there was consideration around marijuana testing. So there was, actually this was brought to me recently, and that was my first I even heard of a reconsideration of the marijuana testing requirement. So some time ago, recognizing that we are a legalized state for marijuana, the Civil Service Commission did loosen their rules around prior usage of marijuana. I believe it was 1 year of usage prior to being tested that they moved it to from, I believe it was 5 years before. Obviously, in a legalized state, we had a lot of people losing out to that criteria. So when they lowered it to a year, that brought in more folks. However, there had been initiative because we're still finding we're losing applicants that could, you could legally drink, you could legally do other things, and legally use marijuana, but that was still being a prohibitive factor for folks taking in that couldn't meet that 1 year of not using criteria. So that there was a consideration by the commission to change that to, from the time of application, you would stop using marijuana. And that we know, I support that because I believe it's something that will also increase our numbers. And that's really not, I don't think effectively lowering standards. What I think it's fixing them to the realities of what we have here in Denver that was being very prohibitive around getting good candidates that were doing something that was legal and not having them go through the process. So that is something that we've encouraged. I see Julia, your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that adjustment makes sense. Agree on the reality of Colorado. I do wonder, you know, if we think about sort of a reimagining of policing and you know, maybe the framework of like service and protection, right? How much of the test is really in the protect realm and how much is in the, or not the test, but just the whole process is in the service realm? And, you know, are we looking for candidates who can build high quality community relationships, who, you know, understand sort of, you know, alternatives to the criminal justice, you know, system and things like that? Like, you know, what sort of qualities might we look for in individuals that are beyond like, you know, shoot, fight, run kind of conditions?
Yeah, thank you for that, Julia. That's important, and that is also part of that. What I talk about is our changing landscape of our applicant pool, right? It used to be police departments, you know, recruited from primarily military, former military, or folks that were in corrections, things like that. We still do that. We still get very good applicants from those ranks, but we also find that we can get good applicants from folks that are in social work and folks that are in customer service and folks that were in maybe a non-traditional job to do that. And that is something, and those are some of the qualities that we see and really like to encourage and recruit. Other qualities where folks have other kinds of things. I've seen social workers go through our academy recently and into this job. One of my ride-alongs was a former social worker, now police officer in District 6. So yeah, those are the definitely qualities that we're looking to. And I think that is really part of our ability in changing our standards and really adapting them to have a more diverse workforce. So definitely that. I think that's really where I think there's opportunity in how we can change our testing and our what folks need to get through to become our police officers or firefighters, is we could really make it focused on, you know, other things. And what I like about changing the written test that they take in is it really can be designed with the vendor that we're using on the sheriff's side for what we want to test versus for some standardized test that's somewhat like an SAT, right? Standardized test that's going to have general skills kind of looking. So hopefully that answered. And so, yeah, so I know that was a long story or long answer, but I really wanted to make sure to give some context and some history there. We continue.
That's the last one, I think.
I see Karen's hand up before you continue. Yep.
Good morning, Director.
Good morning.
I'm wondering if you could give us 2 examples and description of the changes that you've made to the application process as it applies to women and people of color.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first one is what I just talked about. Well, first of all, I think where we have to talk about is, you know, they're going to apply and to make sure that we have folks from that aren't traditional, that people don't necessarily feel like are folks that have been in police service and fire service. We have to be very intentional about where we recruit and how we recruit. So we have to go to those communities and where those communities where people of color are and where women are. And so that's really something that with and we do things like women academies and women exposures to our service. We just had one recently. Our fire department and our Colorado women firefighters posted one at our academy to get women that are interested in the fire service or don't even really know much about it, to give them a hands-on exposure of a day at the academy. We do this with other groups, with females in policing. We have a female policing academy to give them exposure. So having those opportunities so they can learn more about it and they can see this as a job that they can do and that we can that is welcoming to them, I think is the first step. So getting them to apply. The other thing is removing barriers where we've had disparate outcomes in testing. Like I said, I think when it came to the or when it comes to the current civil service test and why we've been anxious to change it is that we can see that outcomes, you know, obviously it has a big outcome on people, any population moving forward to the next level. But I think we'll find disparity in people of color and women candidates that are having trouble getting through that. I know one in particularly that had trouble getting through that. So there's that. And then there's also understanding and really recognizing what are we testing for? Are we testing for like physical criteria because we've always tested for that? Are we testing for things that we've always tested for versus what the job requires? And that's really what we're trying to do around changing of what the test is and what are those standards. And really making and analyzing that we are not having, and every step in the process, we're looking at the data and seeing how are people, where are we losing applicants, and then looking at it through the demographic lens of, are we losing more women in this step and then reevaluating that? Are we losing more candidates of color in this step and reevaluating and figuring that out?
Can you describe one of the barriers that you've examined and changed or removed in this vein?
So that's really, and that's what is, and that's the unique circumstance of a civil service commission. So from my end, there are things we can do, right? We have changed and we have definitely been, and I've led around focusing folks on where are our recruiting efforts, where are we intentionally going into community, in our communities of color, in those communities we are trying to recruit from, where are we intentionally doing our recruiting efforts and focusing there. So we've really done that. That's something I can't control and we can do. But the civil service process, we need the commission to ultimately make those changes. I can encourage it. I can talk about my support of them. We can talk to them. We can facilitate things like peak sessions. But in the end, that is their process. They're an independent body. They're an independent commission, and they have to make those changes. So while I can recommend, I can tell them, hey, this is what we saw when we changed the test, the written test in the sheriff's side, or this is what we saw when we've done this process improvement. I cannot make those process improvements on their side or any sort of change. I can't unilaterally say, change the marijuana criteria. I can't say change the written test you're doing. That is something for the commission to do.
So you're basically trusting the commission to evaluate the kinds of barriers that you think exist in the prior application process so that they no longer continue to be a barrier at going forward instead of making your own recommendations to that?
I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I'm saying I do make recommendations. I've shown them where we've had changes and where we've made changes and where we've done these, what those ramifications. In fact, last week at the Civil Service Commission meeting, I had our safety human resources team went in there and had a presentation on all the changes we had made for the written test on the sheriff's side, shown them the outcomes, shown them the stats, shown them all the things that we've done differently to show them here was our example, here was the change we made, so then they can see that and they can use that as one of the elements that they're assessing as they consider changing the test.
And so my question was asking for an example of a barrier that you recommended either be changed or removed as it relates to women and people of color applicants.
And that would be one example would be the written test, changing out the written test. The other one would be, you know, I had engaged in talks when they were considering replacing the polygraph examination. I had known that the polygraph does have a disparate outcome for folks of color, and that I would support that, but I cannot, and I voiced my support of that, but I cannot force that change.
Okay, thank you.
I think a couple of questions in chat. Do you feel that you have good buy-in from leadership on these changes? And then I'll ask the second one in just a second.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I can speak for the Department of Safety leadership. We work closely on this. Chief Fulton, Chief Thomas have, I think, approached this with the same method, is that we are, encouraging these changes. We also are encouraging them with a balance of not saying we want to lower standards and just get anyone with a pulse in doing these jobs. That's not at all what we're doing. We're trying to get the best applicants for these jobs, make sure we have good applicants that can get into these jobs, and that we can remove any of those barriers or those things that are impacting our ability to hire good folks for these roles. I could also, I could echo the mayor. The mayor has made this a priority from day one. I mean, him replenishing, especially our police and our workforce, has been a priority of his, and it's something that he's set the goal of us reaching. And so that is something. He's also never told us, just hire a body, just get the number, just make the number. He, in fact, has said, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to evaluate where we can make improvements so we get the best candidates.
Thanks. Tymisha is asking, what methods are you using to identify the changes that need to be made?
Yeah, so this has been something that we were able to do on the sheriff's side of the house much more easily, because we can control the data. I mean, we can look at the data and have access to the data. That's not always something that we have on the civil service side, where we can see certain components or how many applicants get through or where we're losing them. We don't typically get to see or track where they're at in the process, or where in fact they're at in the process. So on the sheriff's side of the house, we're definitely, first, one thing we look at is how many applicants are we getting when we have a recruitment or an open application period. So then what we do is, what we found, particularly with sheriff, is when we can pay for Indeed promotions of positions, we were getting good value for that. When we would do an Indeed campaign for really, not a significant amount of money, but we could do an Indeed campaign, we were getting a number of applicants for that. It was paying for itself, really, around the number of applicants. So that is something we've done and continue to do and expanded to do. We also looked and evaluate how effective were we going to job fairs or things like that, or the traditional job fairs. Well, when we looked at the data, we weren't getting a ton of applicants for them. So then we started figuring out, where can we be more effective in getting applicants? And when we do these outreaches, how can we make it as low barrier that we're not handing them, hey, here's this paper form to fill out, or go to this website and apply and take an hour or so to apply. We're working on technology changes where we can get folks on the phone, on the app, can start the application there, where we can make it very low barrier for them. So we got them in, we got their interest, we got their contact, we can then follow up with them on that recruiting, and then really help guide them through that recruiting process. We found that, and we've seen that, especially on the sheriff's side, as we can do that, we have better applicants. And as we've reported, and the sheriff's reported to you, we're getting fuller sheriff's classes that we haven't had in some time because of those changes. We then look at, we were also finding we needed to shorten the process, because if we have an applicant that's applied here, they've probably applied at other departments around our metro. And so we are now in competition. The first person to give them a job is probably going to win. And so speed is also being efficient, not being speed to where we're not doing a careful vetting still, but we can still do that careful vetting, still fit in all the processes, but we have to do it quicker. And that was one of the things that we really measured down to the time of each part of the process, to make sure that we could refine that. And really, we saw that on the sheriff's side of the house, where we were able to do that, where we were able to condense kind of our oversight, have meetings around folks that were doing this, and be more efficient on that and shorten that time. It also equaled more applicants and more recruits that we got into the account.
Sorry, trying to get off mute. Tymisha asked a follow-up question, which was, can you make the data that you're looking at available to the board? And then how has the percentage of women and BIPOC applicants increased? How much time has been removed from the process?
Right. So again, I'm going to have to tell you about the sheriff's side of the house because that's what we control and that's the data that we have control of. The civil service side of the house, we can tell you the actual demographics of the academy classes once they start, because now they are employed and we can get that. And maybe from the beginning where they applied, we can get that. But I can, and then the timeline, we can tell you how it started from police to sheriff or to the beginning from a police applicant to hire. And I'll tell you, it's very long. It's typically, 3 to 6 months long of getting them in. That has been one of the pain points that we continually have is the length of the process. On the sheriff's side, though, we've reduced it significantly. We reduced the, what could have been a 3 or 4 month process down to 4 to 6 weeks of a process getting someone in. That has had a considerable thing, and definitely I can provide that to you. I would actually offer even the same presentation that was provided to the Civil Service Commission could be made available to you all from our Safety, Human Resources, and Recruiting team, because they've done an incredible job identifying this, and you'll find where they've mapped it. They can give you the data, what it's equal to the process improvement and what it's.
Great. And then, yeah, I actually had a question of my own, which was, so the head of the Civil Service Commission is vacant currently. And, I'm not quizzing you on their process, but if you could do a quick overview of how that position gets filled. And then more importantly, I'm interested in understanding what influence or role you have in the selection of that leader. And at what points in the process are you interacting with them?
Right. So, yeah, that's a new, that's a vacant position. That is, just for everyone's clarification, that position is hired by the Civil Service Commission. They are appointed by their board. Their board makes that hiring decision. That is not something that I influence in any way or have any vote or seat at the table. If I'm asked to participate in any sort of interview process or vetting, I would be happy to. Just like how when this board hired the civilian monitor, I was asked, and I think some safety leaders were asked to participate and provide some feedback, but we weren't the ultimate decision makers. You all were. Similar situation with the board director.
Thanks. I see Stefan has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Director Saldate.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. So you've sort of touched on this, but the biggest challenges that the Department of Safety has had in terms of capacity and turnover is in the Sheriff's Department as opposed to the Police Department. You all have done, the city has done a much better job of hiring people for the Denver Police Department and replenishing those ranks than the Sheriff's Department. You've talked about sort of the process and streamlining the process to get more applicants for the Sheriff's Department. But what about the underlying issue? I mean, do you find a lack of, and what is being done to address maybe a lack of interest of people in applying for those positions? Again, sort of given the role that they have in in basically being law enforcement officers for incarcerated persons at our two facilities. What's your view on all that?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, for that question. And it is, it's been since I got here in the city and started with Sheriff's Department in 2014 that they were dealing with a crisis around staffing. They did some things, we did some investments around that, but we're back to those, the same kind of crisis. However, I do see us turning the corner with some of the things that we've talked about and bigger classes. Our last two academy classes were much bigger, and we continue to have a good process in place where we anticipate we're going to have full classes for the rest of this year, and hopefully that'll be our new normal. We are one of the things that I failed to mention, but I think is important, that helped in our recruiting and our retention of Denver Sheriff's deputies. Because it's not just about hiring new ones, it's also about keeping the good ones we have. and is pay. Pay is the bottom line, is something that is important. And I'm not talking about overall benefits package, because I think we all know in the city we have a great overall benefits package. But what I'm seeing from applicants these days is that's not what's going to attract folks. They're going to want to know what's the bottom line pay so they can, pay rent in a high price city, right? And things like that. So the last, this year we had a sheriff's collective bargaining process. They are a collectively bargained union represented team. We go into, every couple of years, we go into this, and I supported, and really pushed, as did the mayor, as did Sheriff Diggins and his leadership team. We supported making considerable steps in their increases in their pay, not only for new applicants, but for those that have been here for some time. I do believe that that has made a positive effect on attracting new applicants and keeping those folks that may have been considering going to other agencies. Second part of that is the work environment. I think we have to acknowledge being a deputy sheriff, working in a custody environment, working in that population it's one of the most difficult jobs in the city. And it is not everyone, it's not a job for everyone, but we have special people that do take on that calling, that are motivated to do it. And I think there is motivation, and we are getting that out and telling our story and recruiting folks around the great job it can be, and the pay, the benefits, all those things that can be attractive to it. I think we are working and being much more effective around getting people recruited to these roles.
Yeah, thank you for that. Have you seen, the last two times I think we visited the county jail, and it's been, it's been really good. The tours have been great, and we've had an opportunity to talk to some of the deputy sheriffs there. And there's been a high level of overtime that has, sort of caused some burnout there. As you mentioned, it's a very difficult and challenging job. And the level of overtime just exacerbates it. And I think, I talked to a couple deputy sheriffs there, and they commented on that. Has the level of overtime gone? I know we're getting a little far afield here, but has overtime gone down there to sort of relieve that type of stress?
It has gotten better, but it's not perfect still. We still have too much overtime because we're filling vacancies, right? We're filling vacant staff positions, particularly when we have call outs, people that are sick, or people that aren't able to be on leave for an injury. It makes the problem worse. However, as we're getting bigger classes that are graduating, we just had one that graduated. It was a large class. That provides a lot of relief for that step. Now, when they graduate, they obviously have a field training time that's going to take before they can be a solo deputy staffing a post. But seeing the class size that came out, that's going to have a significant impact on that overtime level. The next class that we have in right now, that's a full class, that's going to have an impact on that. So it's not an immediate effect, but it's coming in waves. And as long as we're keeping also staff, we are making a positive gain on that overall staffing number. And I think that is where we really make an effect on the overtime.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I don't see any more questions. I'll go to the next question, Daniel. Is that okay? So last month, 9 News published a story highlighting the fact that 2/3 of the 36 Front Range agencies they contacted conducted simultaneous criminal and administrative investigation. It quotes former Douglas County Sheriff Tony Spurlock as saying that concern about internal investigations impeding criminal ones is unfounded and not good service to the community or agency. Do you have any specific concerns about conducting concurrent criminal and administrative investigations? If so, what are they? Excellent question. This is something that is always been a topic dating back to my days of being a police officer, when you have a criminal and administrative investigation. So just for context, I want to let people know kind of the differences. So an employee that is involved in an allegation of wrongdoing or misconduct, or let's say an officer involved shooting, they are subjected, if the allegation is criminal in nature, they will be subjected to, just like anyone else, a criminal investigation. And just like anyone else, any other citizen, They have rights, they have Miranda rights, they have all sorts of rights around that. They also have rights of not, self-incrimination, those types of things. There's a lot of rights that are in play, as we all know, in our criminal justice system. But when that conduct is related to their employment, their rights of not being interviewed or foregoing an interview or a statement are different. In an administrative investigations, we can compel folks to give a statement. So if you're, accused of wrongdoing, I have a deputy or a police officer that's accused of wrongdoing, we bring him in, we call him in for an interview, and that deputy, he or she says, but I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to self-incriminate myself. I serve my Fifth Amendment privilege. Well, in an administrative investigation, they don't have that as a condition of employment. They have to give that. The other thing that is key is that statement, that compelled statement in policing and public safety, we call it Garrity, because it's a case law of Garrity statement. That statement cannot be used against you in a criminal proceeding, with one important caveat. It can be used to impeach you. So let's say I had an investigation on a staff member, John Doe. It was a criminal investigation, and we compelled that person, John Doe, to give a statement, an administrative statement. Let's say they gave an administrative statement where they admitted to the wrongdoing. Let's say on the criminal side, they never gave a criminal statement and that they were charged with this wrongdoing. We could not introduce that confession that we had on the administrative side as evidence. However, if he were to take the stand, or he or she were to take the stand and were to deny it, we could utilize that statement as impeachment material that he had formerly had, said something different. So there's a lot of nuance there. And I give that example because while I have a lot of respect and appreciate Sheriff Spurlock's point here, it's not black and white, and it's not an either or. And depending on the level of seriousness of that criminal allegation and the level of seriousness of the misconduct, it is definitely something that we have to weigh around getting into the trickiness of compelling statements and where that could maybe somehow, or just an administrative investigation could somehow get in the way or sometimes cross paths with a criminal investigation somehow, and maybe unexpectedly or unintentionally impeding or impacting that criminal potential prosecution. One thing that we and the Denver Police Department and Sheriff Department are very cognizant of is preserving the integrity of criminal investigations, right? And preserving the integrity so that that outcome cannot be questioned by any sort of misconduct or any sort of thing that may have made that outcome different than if you had just had the facts. So that's something that has to be weighed. Typically here in Denver, we do not conduct the administrative investigation until the criminal investigation is concluded. What a conclusion of a criminal investigation would mean is if there were charges, that those charges were adjudicated, or if there weren't charges, that the district attorney or the prosecuting entity would have the opportunity to review the case, consider charges, and then they then produce what they have is their sheet. It could either be they turned it down, or no reasonable likelihood of conviction, or some problem they turned, or they said they didn't have it, or there's not a meeting the burden, right? Or there was other things, or they further it for more further investigation, right? That we would need to have that outcome. Once we have that outcome, then the administrative investigation takes place. And that is something that we do. I do get it, because I do get the issue that then causes the administrative investigative outcome to be delayed, and sometimes over a year, right? Because the criminal investigation can take time. I'll give you case in point, the Lodo shooting. The Lodo shooting where we had an officer that shot some rounds that hit bystanders. We had a criminal proceeding that took some time. And then once that criminal proceeding took place, then we're able to kick off our administrative investigation, but after some time. The other thing that that may, but we try to mitigate that, that may then impact is, do you have someone on the street that could be facing criminal charges and doing their job, still exposed to public exposure? Well, how we mitigate that is typically if they're, well, when they are faced criminal charges, we're mandated to take them off the street. And we're mandated, especially for felonies, to put them on a leave status, and it's leave without pay if you're a Denver police officer. So that is what we, or civil service commission position, or firefighter. So that is what we do to mitigate those types of things. We also, if there was a policy failure or some other things, we don't wait for an administrative finding to make that change or to make that correction or to do that. We will do that. We don't need to wait on an administrative investigation. However, I do, and I still also have, I do think there are opportunities that we can conduct a criminal and a administrative investigation in parallel. You can start the investigation of acquiring documents and records, and maybe interviews of subjects that aren't the criminal subject. And those are things, and those are opportunities that we continue to analyze and look at. And I'd love to work with the commission on that, with you all, and obviously with our independent monitor, on when we believe that we might meet the criteria that we could consider that. I'll just say the caveat there is, we definitely want to make sure that we're being careful, that we're not doing this as a blanket for everything, that we are considering the seriousness of a criminal allegation and the potential of disruption of that with an administrative investigation, that we're properly prioritizing when we do those and when we don't. But I am definitely open for consideration and discussion around this, and would love feedback from you all and from particularly the monitor on identifying those cases.
It's like, if we have to call it.
I see Stefan has a question, unless the
Okay.
hand is old.
No, it's new hand.
Okay.
New hand.
So a lot to unpack there, Director Saldate, on that issue. And it is a complicated one, and I'm somewhat familiar with it, given my background. And Garrity is, clearly important there, which you did a very good job of explaining. But let me ask you this. If you're in a position to answer, I mean, I'm sure that the DA's office, for example, would prefer that their investigation go forward perhaps without without a concurrent administrative investigation going on, because that can complicate things. Look, as a former prosecutor, I can even understand that. But nonetheless, I also very much am sympathetic to the position of the community, which is, hey, there appears to be on its face misconduct here by a law enforcement officer, and it's not right that an administrative proceeding can't proceed, because, as you point out, not only would you have to wait until the criminal proceeding is completed, if there's an appeal, that could also delay it even further. And then you're talking years, and it's outside, the public, has lost some interest in it. Victims have not felt like they've been heard and their positions vindicated, all of that. So I found it interesting that you were saying that perhaps you could move forward to some degree concurrently with an administrative investigation, but how much would the DA's office be trying to give you their views on that, guidance on what you should or shouldn't do with respect to the administrative proceeding, because they would be concerned about implicating their criminal investigation, particularly if they were doing grand jury investigation at the same time? It becomes very complicated. So would you actually coordinate with the DA's office in terms of proceeding with a concurrent administrative proceeding, in terms of what you would do and what you wouldn't do?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. That's a very, very important point, and that's a very important stakeholder group, and one we would have to engage in this process. Because you're right. I mean, I'm not going to say that in every situation the DA would say they do not want us proceeding with anything. But you give good examples, like if there's a grand jury and there's a confidentiality of that grand jury, and that we're doing things that may be running afoul of that would obviously have an impact, and we wouldn't want that. And that's probably that's what I meant really around the careful nature of our approach here. we would definitely have to engage, we have good engagement with our current DA, Beth McCann. Both candidates for DA, Leora Joseph and John Walsh, I think will be very approachable around these issues and be able to have a dialogue around these issues. And obviously that would be their input would weigh in on whether we would want to proceed on an administrative investigation. But I'm glad you raised that, because that is a very important stakeholder group here.
Thanks.
Next question is, have you given any additional thought to the creation of a public database for discipline orders that you issued? So we've given a lot of thought and consideration around not only this, but on other ways to be transparent and to make it more easy for our community and any of those that are interested in this information to have access to it. And I really got to give kudos to Emily. She's really called this out for us and really has worked for us to do this. One additional place that we're looking to have these things put in, I think we're going to have an example coming up maybe even next week on, we have our first administrative finding or non-financial settlement that we are engaging in, and as our commitment to you all and to some of the change that you've asked for, we will be publishing that on our website, and then also publishing the proof of us meeting those conditions as well. So we'll be continuing that, but in that vein, we're also thinking of what else can we put out there in this portal, in this web page that will be information for that. As I've discussed with you all in the past, what I'm balancing and weighing and is, that eternal scarlet letter A, right? Or that eternal record for that officer or for that person that was a subject of discipline. We all make mistakes. We have all made a mistake in our thing or something that we're not proud of. There's also redemption from your mistake, and there's also, when is it done, right? When is it, you've served your time, you've served your thing, in the criminal justice system, people can have records expunged. People can have, their past conduct, stricken from records or sealed. In this, I mean, we haven't made those considerations for folks that have gotten disciplined. I do believe, though, and I firmly believe that we need to make it, we need to show our community that, and any stakeholder around this, how we've held our people accountable, and when they've had bad conduct, this is what we've done, and this is where it's at, and this is what we do. We were one of the leaders in our metro around providing that level of transparency to the press. Every month, we give all discipline orders that were issued in that month to the press, and they report on it. And typically they report on the pretty egregious issues or ones that are newsworthy, as they should, and as we support, and as we've always been transparent on. It also helps breed accountability around us not continuing to make those same mistakes and building in measures to prevent those types of issues. But I'm going to tell you that in and of itself, we're a human organization that's going to continue to make mistakes. And so we need to do that. So what I'm trying to balance is, and I would definitely love to hear your input. Obviously, we will be talking to the monitor, our employee unions, our representative unions, because I think they have a stake in this as well, around when we put something out there, or if we were to put it out there, are there parameters around when it's taken off, how long it stays on there based on the level of discipline? I think those are things we need to. But the fact of the matter is, once it's out on the internet for 1 day or 10 minutes, it's forever. It is forever. Even when we were to take it down, there was a record of that somewhere, somehow, somewhere. And so that is a balance that I need to really consider, and that is something I don't have an answer for with you yet. I need to talk to more people. I don't know that there's a perfect answer here, but I will say that we aren't doing these in a vacuum. We do produce them. They are newsworthy. They are provided to the press. You all have access to them, as did the monitor, obviously. So I think there is a way, and we are still considering it, and I'm happy to discuss that. Go ahead, Daniel.
Just a note, I think you skipped one question.
I'm sorry.
If you could just.
Oh, I did.
Before you did.
Yeah, I did. Thank you for pointing that out. So The question before that, I'm sorry, I skipped down to it as I was scrolling down, the page kind of was weird. Does the Department of Safety plan to include the acquisition of the public portal module for IA Pro on its budget for 2025? Have you been able to confirm how much it would cost to acquire and implement it? So yeah, very good question. This is something I actually brought to you all when it was first made available. IA Pro, just for community members on the scene, and for those that don't know, IA Pro is our case management application for our internal affairs investigations. It's the access that the OIM has to monitor our evidence, our videos, all those things. That's the portal where we do it. So that's where we manage complaints, intake them, track them, do the case management, disposition, all those are in there. When IA Pro was owned by CI Technologies, some time ago, they came out with a public portal. This was basically a website mechanism that on our public website, denvergov.org/safety or /OIM or /COB, where we could give that link to the public. If you want to make a complaint or a commendation, here is the link. That would generate a form for the complainant or reportee to put in the information. That would then populate automatically into IA Pro. It would give them a reference number, case number, and then it would be able to then give them a tracking mechanism and status kind of updates as to where the case is, once it's made, who will be assigned the case, all those things. So it was really great. They had just rolled out the technology, so it had been an early adopter kind of case. And we were offered it in Denver. They know we're very innovative cities. They offered it to us at the time. That was going to cost $60,000 to purchase, and there was going to be obviously maintenance fees on it going forward. We did some initial intake and stuff, but then it fell victim to our budget. We didn't have the budget at the time. That was kind of a mid-year kind of thing. We'd already had that in our thing. So that has been since then. CI Technologies has been acquired by a larger tech company, a larger police tech company. And so we have inquired with that tech company if what would the pricing structure be as I'm preparing for 2025 budget expansions and requests. And I would like to include it in our budget. So we have not heard from them updated pricing or what it might be. We actually engage this vendor on other items. So I'm also hopeful that we can maybe get bundle rates or things like that since we do other products with this vendor. So we are trying to do that. It is something that I'm hopeful that one day we can fund and afford. I think it would help a lot in administrative processing of complaints and make it a much easier experience, a better experience. I also think it aligns with the mayor's goal around better government and more streamlined government for our community and our community members. So I'm hopeful that we can get it, and I will keep you posted as that progresses. The other question, really good one around our current halfway house capacity. So as we've talked about in the past, I know the board's very familiar with this situation. In 2019, back then we had our halfway house capacity was operated by private providers in the space. City Council in 2019 made the vote to divest from those private companies. As we did that, then we were hit with a pandemic, and then we were hit with the cost of all kinds of things. So we were basically handed a situation where we needed to replenish and replace that bed capacity for halfway house reentry beds very quickly in an environment that wasn't very easy to do so. Real estate was sky high. Trying to get places that could be zoned for, or were already zoned for halfway housing, having places that didn't need or were needing a lot of renovation to get them up to standard and current code to build these. It's something that our director of community corrections, Greg Morrow, and team have worked very diligently on. Our team, our real estate team in the city, and others have worked very hard on. And so right now, our current bed capacity is 273 beds. I'm excited to announce that our Moore Center, MORE Center, which is one of the newer houses, a brand new facility that we actually refurbished facility that we've just gotten online. We took that on in January or June 19th of this month. We were able to take custody of that building. Keys were handed over, it's ready. We are now we've been hiring staff to staff it so that we can do that. What we're going to be doing then is taking people that are in our Dahlia facility that is going to be temporarily closed so we can expand the beds and renovate that facility, bring them over to Dahlia. We're also going to try to expand bed size there and programming. What we have found, and we found this because we have created two of our own other sites. One is a female identifying serving reentry house, our Project Elevate Center, which I think some of you have been to, and our Impact Center, which is at the old Building 19 at the jail. Those entities, what we found is that we can do a really good job and really have effective programming by doing this. We just know that it's been much more expensive than contracting this out, hiring our own staff, bringing in our own infrastructure, buildings and things. But I think what we're going to find is that we're going to have better service and outcomes from it. So meaning more successful outcomes for the people that go through these programs. So when Moore Center is currently online and we have it filled, and we will work with Emily and Julia and you, Daniel, to offer up a tour for you all. And then that would also give you an opportunity to discuss with Greg and our community corrections teams on our anticipated other kinds of investments where we're trying to have new facilities. And that goes into our next question around do we plan to add new facilities in 25 and 26? As I just talked about, Dahlia is going to close temporarily. The site was purchased. We actually purchased it. It was leased before we purchased it, but we're going to go and we're going to refurbish it and then make the bed capacity much higher. So when that is done, and hopefully it'll be done either in late 2025 or early 26, that will expand our bed capacity to 363 from that 270-ish number that we have now. So that's our next step. We are continually, when I say continually, it's on our real estate, Lisa Lumley in real estate, our director of real estate. She's really, every time she's out there scouring, looking for buildings, looking for opportunities, looking for places that may become our next center, that is what she's out there doing and trying to find those locations for us. So as we're building this current sets, refurbishing places, we are looking for more there. In the end, what's our only limiter there is budget and resources, but that's something that we are working on. I went over a couple of things there. Do we have any questions in that regard?
I think we're good.
Daniel, I haven't been tracking time. How much time do we have left?
We have time to go through this last one.
Okay, great.
You can do it quickly.
Sure. Yeah. Let me know. I'll get through there. This has many parts to it, but I want to make sure I give you all a thorough response. So the last one is in regards to the 8 Center and how it is transitioning to the Office of Neighborhood Safety and what is the status of that handoff. So I'll quickly talk about that transition because I haven't been able to talk to you all directly about it. I know you all have read about it. You've seen some things about it. So Office of Neighborhood Safety is something that has been discussed for some time now, even dating back to the previous Hancock administration. It's been something that I've always been a supporter of and a proponent of. It really, for me, it meets the criteria for me of what I believe effective policing is, and that is community-based, it's public health focused, all those things I talked about at the beginning. And so I think Office of Neighborhood Safety and what I've seen in other offices around the country, it could really help us have a safer city and more engaged community around safety. So I've always been a supporter of it. I've also always been a supporter of it not residing in safety. So these talks first began with the Reimagining Policing and Public Safety Task Force. Doctors Calderon and Doctors Davis had brought this in. They brought the Vera Institute, a think tank around this. I saw one of their presentations. I really dived into it, started looking at other jurisdictions that had them, really started discussing it with our former administration. At that time, it was really a project that was happening or wanting to get stood up, when Mayor Hancock was leaving office. So at that point, there was an agreement to have it studied, to pay for a study to see how it could be, or even if it was a good idea for the city. That study was funded through CU Denver. Dr. Sheila Huss performed that study, her and her team, and that study results were given and really, I think, affirmed that it would be a good idea to have an Office of Neighborhood Safety, some questions to be answered about where it should be housed, how it should be formulated and budget and all those things. So it was done. I continue to going into the new administration. Mayor Johnston has always maintained a commitment around having this and funding. It's just been really trying to find the money. So in his first budget, which he was involved with, like right when he was taking office, we were already in the budget process. So it was something that was highlighted as a priority from council and others, and didn't make it into this last year's budget, but in 2025 budget, I know the mayor was always hopeful to get this going. I had talked about him with the mayor's administration and with others. There was, where would it be? First of all, where would it be? What would it make up? And I really had listened and understood and agreed with the community, especially the Reimagining Policing and Public Safety Task Force, around their emphasis that it not be in safety. So with that, I started working with other partners here in the city, started identifying programs. But what I knew was critical is that they would need safety resources and budget to get it started. It was critical that our teams and safety were doing some of the work that would and is needed in Office of Neighborhood Safety, with some of our violence interruption work, our youth diversion work, and all that are residing currently in youth safety programs and in our Office of Community Violence Solutions, formerly GRID. So I realized that up front. I also realized that that it needed some executive support, because those are big programs and needed that kind of level of support. And if they're going to be transferred to another department, it needed to have the proper support with it. And like I said, budget and resources. So after discussing that and really discussing it with my peers in the city, and who is a close partner with me and someone I have the utmost respect for, Dr. Ben Sanders, our executive director, our chief equity officer, and our executive director of Office of Social Equity and Innovation. And so we started talking and we started meeting and we started trying to figure out a plan that we could propose to Mayor Johnston leadership team to really affect this change and propose what this could look like and how we could even get it started this year in a mid-budget period. And part of that was going to take a significant investment from safety to transfer resources over, which I was willing to do because I think I'm very, like I said, I'm supportive of it. And I'm not supportive of it just in words, I'm supportive of it in my actions and with my resources. While it is very hard, because I've had good, close relationships with these folks that are in these departments for quite some time, even previous to my work here as the executive director. And giving up the level of talent and resources is hard. I also know that they are going to flourish and be able to flourish even more under OSCI and with Dr. Sanders' leadership. So right now where we're at is really the logistics. Effectively we have changed. They are under Dr. Sanders' organization, but we're effectively moving the logistics. So in our workday functionality of moving them under budget assignment and things like that, we're working on having it formalized where budgets are formally moving over in the 2025 budget process, in the appropriation process. But right now we are moving budget over by, Dr. Ben, here's the people, the staff, the things, the grants that you have under your control now, and obviously the people. So everything that was with those teams, down to their computers, down to their grants and their resources, goes over with them. So all that support. Also then working on the logistical support of human resources support. And like I said, grant management. These teams rely a lot upon grants and manage a lot of grants, especially in working with community. So really working on the logistics around that to make sure everything's buttoned up. So that work is ongoing. I forgot to mention that one of the executives on my safety team is transferring over with them to provide that executive level leadership in that state league mix. She's really leading the logistics of the move there, and it's really helpful because she's been here in safety. She's been here a little while, so she can really work closely with our teams around making sure we cross all the T's and dot all the I's as we're going and moving things over. And she's also helped lead a peak process around where they're engaging with the stakeholders on the teams, getting, the teams that are going to now commingle working together and getting their priorities and strategic roadmap and engaging community. I know they're now working closely with community and the community stakeholder groups because that is really what is the central focus of an Office of Neighborhood Safety is that community involvement, community centered approach to safety. So any questions on that? Yes, ma'am.
How does the community and the, I guess, kind of like maybe a liaison in Dr. Calderon, how is that gonna transfer with the changes being made?
Yeah, so I know Dr. Sanders is meeting now with community stakeholders and leadership and leaders, including Dr. Calderon, Dr. Davis, other leaders and community across the city. I know that the mayor, when he announced this as well, he had talked about having a community advisory board that would be appointed that would help lead and inform this Office of Neighborhood Safety.
Director, I had a question too.
Okay.
I mean, just generally about the aid center, I know you're focusing more on just the Office of Neighborhood Safety, but in terms of, I think, well, I certainly feel that it's critical to, if you will, publicize the existence and use of the aid center more. Look, I think it's been effective but it's got limited hours, limited capacity, all of the things, because of budget constraints, all of those things that we've talked about today and before. But I think in terms of establishing more community trust and involvement with public safety, I think, and the Office of Neighborhood Safety, I think it's important. I don't know if there's any sort of thinking about the best way to get the word out about the aid center, which can be incredibly effective as an alternative to typical law enforcement, as I believe you share.
Yeah, thank you. And so yeah, the aid center is critical to this and it being part of this. And I think being in the Office of Neighborhood Safety will give it even more opportunity to work directly with community. We'll say there's lots of community providers that work there and in the space now. It's really expanding that and expanding the reach. And you pointed out the hours and the limited hours. That is something that is not just confined to the aid center. Most systems of government things operate during business hours. We have been and worked to extend an hours through a grant, and that's what we're doing now. What is really exciting, and I think is really going to help kick off this new start in ONS, is the aid center's role with Roads to Recovery. Roads to Recovery is the initiative that Mayor Johnson has announced, and one of probably important goals of getting 200 people into recovery from substance misuse and reentry from that, really trying to make an impact on that population. As we did House 1000, and what we saw was so many of our community that are dealing with unsheltered homelessness, also are dealing with substance misuse, and opioids, but opioids aren't the only things, fentanyls aren't the only things that are affecting our community, as are methamphetamine and other drugs. And the abuse of those drugs, along with untreated, sometimes co-occurring untreated mental illness, is really hard to get people from into that recovery and into a more stable thing. If they're not housed, if they're living under a tarp on a street corner, that's not the way to do it. So that was one of the impetuses around House 1,000, get people indoors, get them into a stable environment so we can then help them with their next step. And that is helping them focus on their recovery and support there. So that is really what we're trying to do here. And the aid center is going to be integral to that. The case management services that they're standing up, the LEAD program and other programming that is there. There's community providers like Hazelbrook and other sober living kind of environments that are partners that are staged out of there that can help expand those services and really cast that wide net for our community members to enter roads to recovery. And the aid center is going to be central to that. It's really going to serve as one of the headquarters models of that. So that is where I'm really anxious that they're going to be working in that. And then also, they are we have some grants that were coming on this year with them that's going to be able to expand their hours, their scope, working with special populations, with populations like justice involved women and justice involved women of color, really helping design programming for them. So we are all working on how we can staff that more effectively so that we can have those resources available to the police officer that's trying to divert someone at night or in that encounter. So that is stuff that we're working through. Daniel, how much time do you want me to get to the next part of this?
I think if we could just maybe jump to the last two bits of the data questions about the lead and drop-offs, and then I think we can call it.
So now that I talked a little bit about LEAD and how it's going to have a central focus, but first of all, LEAD is one of the programs that's at the aid center, but it's not necessarily an aid center program. It's one of the things that are at the aid center that they work closely with. So that is that long-term, it's law enforcement assisted diversion. It's that working with the case management, long-term case management to try to treat the root cause of some of the issues that have led to maybe that criminal justice contact. So in collaboration with the downtown District 6 Police Homeless Outreach Team and our police department's Crisis Services Bureau, we're serving a greater number of those that are frequently arrested and through the referral pipeline. So we do have folks that are frequent. It's actually what was the impetus for Aid Center even starting. It was police officers recognizing they're arresting the same folks that were just cycling in and out of jail. And typically those folks were the downtown District 6 officers that were dealing with folks. So we are, here's some of the most recent numbers around this. And like our District 6 homeless outreach team has contributed to at least 20 of those referrals and as many as 27 that are that have been coded as DPD referrals into the aid center. And 14 of those were that warm handoff, meaning the lead case managers were able to go out into the field and meet the police officers at that place of contact, really meeting where people are at. And so they could start that screening and then that referral process. For the next part of that question of how many people have been voluntarily dropped off at the aid center by police officers, we've talked about this before. This is that number that is hard because this is not a mandated field or a mandated reporting mechanism. We want people to come into the aid center as low barrier as possible. We also want them to come in without that stigma that they come out of the back of a police car in handcuffs. So that is something that they're not required to say when they get dropped off. We also don't have them escorted in by police. Once they get on the sidewalk out in front of the aid center, they come in by their own fruition. It is their voluntariness in the program. They're not getting brought in handcuffs, in no means necessary, or escorted by a police officer as they're coming in. Where folks have self-identified, they've identified 20 that have come from their referral from the police department, 12 that have come from our street engagement team, our SET team, 4 from STAR, our STAR response, and 14 from our lead team. So that is where we've the numbers that we are able to capture now. I do think, Stephan, that your recommendation around publicly identifying and publicly posting stats, data, and things like that, I think is important, and is something that I will encourage the aid center and folks to do. I know it's something that they're working to do, and I know, especially in this partnership with ONS now, and being under ONS's leadership, I know that that community hub that the aid center is hoped to be and has become really gets expanded. One thing I'll say that since our last meeting, we had another warrant forgiveness event hosted there at the aid center. These have been tremendously successful. These have been broadcasts where people can come in, get connected directly to court. We have a courtroom operating right in there with judges. We have the public defender, the municipal and state public defender. We have all our resources and services. We have prosecutors there, and we were able to reset warrants. No one gets arrested in these events. Reset warrants, reset cases, get people truly that fresh start. That is a barrier to so many just getting a job or being able to drive around, not have their head on a swivel, right? And so that continues to be a very successful event. We've now hosted 3 of them. We're continuing to work on the process so we can serve more and host more. So that's just one example, I think, of how we're expanding the reach there. So hopefully, Daniel, I got his time left. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
I'm sorry, one other question. Of the people that you're able to track that are being accessing service through aid, are you also tracking unhoused people who are receiving citations?
So yeah, so the long story to that is we're not doing it in concert with that of the treatment there, but that is something that we're also focusing on, and I know it's actually been the subject of recent core requests for our office around how many times have we enforced the camping ordinance, or how many times have we enforced the camping ban, how many times have crimes of homelessness been enforced. Those are data that we are looking at and we are trying to get at. I will say we are also tracking from the Housing 1,000 initiative, and from getting more people indoors and having less encampments. We have seen a marked decrease in the number of encampment calls and the number of encampment responses that we've had. But we're also tracking those situations where, in fact, officers do make arrests at encampments, or for folks that have warrants, folks that may be violating other crimes at these encampments. So those data are being kept.
So does a citation ultimately result in a warrant if it's not tended to, so to speak? And is that type of warrant one that can be disposed of through the warrant forgiveness program?
Yes, I think that is something that's a problem. That problem you just highlighted there is one that we've been working at reducing that number from the person that first involvement or that contact with police that ends up in an arrest or citation. That's something we're trying to reduce, because what you said there is exactly what happens. Those typically result in a warrant, which then equals typically a different arrest or another contact with criminal justice system. So that's what Fresh Start programming is. Also, another thing that the Aid Center hosts is the Homeless Outreach Court. So that is also an opportunity. If you don't know your court date, you don't know if you missed it, you don't know if you're not, you can go to Homeless Outreach Court and just get on the docket that day. We have it. We're hosting it at the Aid Center on occasion. And there's I think at St. Francis Center, they also have an outreach court there, and you're able to get those adjudicated. But those are things that we are working on. And then when we're talking about roads to recovery, we're working on, as when we get people that say, hey, I would like to get into medically assisted treatment for my opioid addiction, but let's say they have a warrant. We're trying to get those things streamlined so that warrant doesn't become a barrier, so that we're able to get people into treatment, into other diversions, and not have those low-level warrants be barriers. Obviously, there needs to be accountability. There needs to be a judge that sets what happens with that. But we're trying to work with the courts on how can we better serve folks, get them into treatment, get those warrants taken care of, so that it doesn't equal more jail time or more, that it gets them on a pathway to recovery.
Okay.
And I hope I didn't go over too much, sir.
I think that is all the discussion, all the questions that we had for you, Director Saldate. So thank you for your time, and your answers. I have just two sort of moving to board business.
Thank you, Director.
Thank
Yes,
you all. Take care.
thank you.
All right.
Moving to board business, before an executive session, I'll just flag a couple of things, that I'll include in a roundup email today, for you to pay extra attention to. One is that there is going to be a screening on July 11th in the evening. There's going to be a screening of a movie called Reimagining Safety. The screening is being hosted by the Denver Task Force to Reimagine Policing and Public Safety. They're going to have a panel afterwards. There's an opportunity for us to have sort of a table there and host a table there. But what they ask for in exchange for that is to, for us to promote the event to our network, and then, allow them to use our name or logo in advertising the event. And so if that's something that the board wants to host a table at and be present at, and then also, gauge the board's willingness to sort of lend our name to that event, and wanted to check in with you guys before doing anything there. So if anyone has any immediate thoughts, very open to them. Otherwise, can look at a little bit more of the information via email and then share.
I think it's a good idea for us to be there and to show support.
Thanks.
And have a table. I just looked, I've got an event that night on July 11th. But yeah, but having a table would be good there. Yeah.
I'll send out a little bit more information along with a link to the trailer for it if folks want to take a look at that. There's also going to do a little bit of a straw poll via email about some scheduling things. First being NACOL is the NACOL conference is going to be in October 13 to 17 in Tucson, Arizona. There's not the early registration deadline is I think in early August, so we've still got a month on that. But just want to get that on people's calendars and gauge some initial interest, because that does play into budget as well. If we have a lot of people who want to go, that affects our ability to spend money on other things. Other things including potential strategic planning effort. Our current strategic plan runs through the end of the year. And a 20th anniversary event celebrating the 20th anniversary since the ordinance passed that created the Citizen Oversight Board. That's on October 4th. And so depending on, how big of an event we want to have, I would be looking for a board member to sort of volunteer and partner with me on that, working on the agenda, on the details of that. So that'll all be in the follow-up email here, but please take a look at that.
Will the NACOL conference be at the same hotel where you, Karen, and I
Yes,
they attended earlier?
Yes, I think there was a COVID deal where they had to cancel, but they got, in order to keep their refund and money, they had to come back twice. So the year we went was a little smaller, so they ended up committing to do it twice. So
I thought it was a good location. I liked it.
It's a nice resort. It's pretty out of town, but it is nice. Or a nice hotel, I should say. Great. In that case, we can move. Seeing no public comment or questions in the Q&A. Give folks just 2 seconds or a minute to do that. Can move to Elizabeth Castle, monitor. I don't think we have anything on the docket for you during public session. But just figured I'd check. Do you have anything that you'd like to discuss in open session?
I can cover some topics quickly. We have a few minutes left.
Sure. And then I think we have also like one or two things to discuss in executive session. So go ahead.
I meant an executive session.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
In that case, can we have a motion?
I move to adjourn.
Thank you, Steph.
Second.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. All in favor of moving to executive session to discuss confidential
Aye.
investigative
Aye.
material? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes. Thank you all for your time, and see you in executive session.